Hi, welcome back to Plan 9 Crunch. I am Joe Gibson, and today I will be ranking the Wolfman movies. I have gathered 10 films here for your consideration, each of which including the phrase Wolfman, or some derivative thereof, in the original title of the film. Initially, I wanted to specifically only include films called The Wolfman, or Wolfman, without the. And there are lesser-known films from 1915, 1923, and 1995 called The Wolfman. However, those three all fell apart for consideration here. The 1915 film has nothing to do with werewolves, so that'd be a facetious inclusion. The 1995 film is Taiwanese, and cursory research suggests it's not gotten a widespread English translation. Really, the only one I had any interest in of these was a 1923 film. Apparently, an upperclassman's son becomes a murderous wolfman every time he drinks alcohol. But that's a lost film, so who can say for sure what it's really about? Until we find it. In any case, then my sole criterion became that it includes the word wolfman, or a translation of that in its original title. And that stipulation was that I could include some of the Paul Naschy Waldemar Daninsky films alongside the Talbot series and remakes, but a funny thing happens when your single criterion is that each film wears being a Wolfman story on its sleeve, because not only do half of Naschy's films not contain that word in the title, but the Monster Alley films of House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein are now off the table too. Still, I got to 10 fairly easily, only having to watch 2 new ones for this, so I will list them off for you in the order of release, and then into the ranking. The Wolfman, 1941. Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. La Marca del Hombre Lobo. La Furia del Hombre Lobo. Dr. Jekyll, El Hombre Lobo. Wolfman, 1979. El Retorno del Hombre Lobo. House of the Wolfman. The Wolfman 2010, and Wolfman 2025. Now, some of those titles sound almost exactly the same, which is why I specified the years, but The Wolfman from 1941 has a hyphen between wolf and man. Well, The Wolfman 2010 combines the words without the need for a hyphen. Wolfman 1979 also has as one word, minus definite article, but Wolfman 2025 is 2 words. One more disclaimer. The names Lawrence Talbot, Sir John Talbot, and Gwen Conliffe were referred to 2 wildly different characterizations in 2 of these films, and Paul Naschy's films will reuse the names Waldemar Daninsky, Karen, Erica, Barbara, Irenaeus Daninsky, and more, in similar but different contexts film to film. So, number 10, House of the Wolfman. This is a movie that doesn't really work on any level. Aside from the monster designs, which are also barely in the movie, it is technically the missing 40s Monster Alley film, House of the Wolfman, that includes Dracula, the werewolf, the Frankenstein monster, a witch, a ghoul, and so many more. I'm not going to spend very much time at all on this, but you can find House of the Wolfman fairly easily on YouTube, and it's a pretty short film at only 1:17. That said, it's structurally missing at least 20 minutes of setup for the other monsters to pay off character arcs and justify the existing plot points, but there is some fun to be had there. The entire cast, even including Ron Chaney, is pretty bad here, but one of them's trying his best Horace Busey Jones, if you like the style of humor of the Bowery Boys. Not that he pulls it off too well. Anyway, number 9. Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman is such a depressing film to place here, because there is a cut of this film that I think would absolutely be at the top of the list. The original shooting script that included Bela Lugosi's dialogue as the monster, crafts an interesting juxtaposition between one monster that wants to die because of all the pain he's caused, and one monster that wants to live to cause even more pain. After the cuts, this film is incomprehensible on a plot and even theme level. Talbot just knows Frankenstein had a diary and exactly where to find it, because now mute Frankenstein's dialogue telling him all that is gone. The other angle to this film that Igor Frankenstein represents, the foil that he is to Talbot, is completely excised from the script, and it takes the most interesting versus horror movie and makes it one of the sloppiest Universal Monsters films there is. That said, the performances are still great, and there's an all-time great Wolfman movie in there if we can find a cut with Lugosi's dialogue restored. All right, number 8. It absolutely pains me to have this film higher than Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, but on a technical level, Wolfman 2025 is much better than the previous two here. The performances are mostly great as well. I don't like the direction for the 10-year-old child to act like a 5-year-old child, but that's just par for the course, I guess. The gimmick of Blake's wolf vision that the film slips into a few times is a lot less goofy than it would sound, and actually pretty effective in getting you in the head of the main character, which you seldom are for werewolf transformations. This film, like a few others on this list, also has something to say about what being the Wolfman means, but that's where it kind of falls apart. Alright, so nobody saw this thing in theaters. I don't want to spoil too much of it, but I do have to backtrack and cover a fair bit of ground here, because again, no one saw this thing in theaters. Blake Lovell, in a struggling marriage with his wife Charlotte, tries not to pass along to his daughter Ginger the abusive lessons his dad taught him. And when the family goes to Blake's father Grady's home after Grady has been declared dead in absentia, a wolfman infects Blake, and the film spends the rest of that night showing Blake's slow transformation into something that might harm the rest of his family. For the theme to even kind of work, it has to be obvious that Blake's father is the other wolfman. But it's also just pretty blatant in the movie. It's treated as a reveal, kind of. Also, they're not werewolves in this, just victims of some rabies-type disease that changes you into looking like a wolf, kind of. It's basically a zombie movie, not a werewolf one, and the idea of the Wolfman curse, his abusive fathering, doesn't have any kind of through line here, because in the end, after neutralizing his father, Blake only hunts down his family so they will put him out of his misery, and it's quite obvious in the film he's not trying to hurt them. Also, his daughter is Ginger, named after Ginger Snaps, a famous werewolf movie, and she doesn't get turned or anything. Sorry, I'm spoiling quite a bit of this movie, but it's bad. I like the idea of smaller werewolf affairs with minimal deaths that release the building tension, but this film does not build tension past the first half, partially because the characters don't take it seriously in the ways that they should. The film also sets up a different way for Blake to kill himself that would have been more poignant in the opening, but it forgets about that because cause and effect are not the focus here. If you want me to do a full review of the film substantiating these claims and exploring everything right and wrong in the movie, let me know, but I'll not do it otherwise. I like a good deal of the movie, but I have also thought about it a fair bit and allowed the flaws to set in. This video's slot on the schedule was originally a comparison between this and the 2010 film, but I scrapped that so I could focus more on the other Wolfman films I appreciate. And ironically enough, here's one that I don't appreciate all too much, but there's some parts of it, again, that I like. Number 7, I am very torn about Dr. Jekyll and the Wolfman. On the one hand, Paul Naschy gets to show off his talent for playing Daninsky, the werewolf, and now also Mr. Hyde, completing one of the Universal Monsters crossovers Talbot never got to do. But this movie is very mean-spirited, especially towards women, in a way that gets distracting. Okay, I get it. Waldemar is a good man, practically raised by an ostracized witch. So when he sees women in danger, he'll help them. So his equal and opposite werewolf side is an indiscriminate murderer, but especially one that targets women. That's the baseline understanding going in. In the first half of the movie, again, indiscriminate killings, but also he develops a romance with a widow that he saves from 3 men trying to assault her, and thus takes on a more virtuous and protective role. So then it hits even harder to see the Wolfman in the second half of the movie assault a random woman in an elevator, and then a prostitute. And I mean assault. He also undresses them as the Wolfman. Once Mr. Hyde enters the picture, he starts gleefully stripping and torturing women. Because that's the unfiltered evil that Waldemar usually only lets out partially and involuntarily as the Wolfman. I get it. That doesn't make it fun to watch. The beginning of the movie, where the 3 rapists and their friends try to outmaneuver Daninsky, is a diverting enough plotline, because usually in these kinds of movies, the monster would seek out the rapist one by one as revenge, but here they just keep coming and dying. I like this take on Jekyll, his lineage, specifically through his surviving grandson, but he's less developed in the cast than is optimal. There's a really great movie in here. There's also a very trashy, sadistic movie in here. It's not really fully either one. I have number 7. in here twice, but this one's number 6. My notes aren't perfect. Number 6. I am surprised that the 2010 remake of The Wolfman made it this high on the list. Usually it does on the rankings I've seen before this. I've always been a bit confused why, but I've assumed it's the potential and some of the strengths making it through the flaws and troubled production. That's at least what they say. That said, the scares are quite effective, despite the massive tonal shift in the bombastic 2000s monster film set pieces. It somehow manages to include an impermeable gothic atmosphere. Even more so than the original film to a degree, because that was trying to be more modern. The main roles are all pretty severely miscast, but it's difficult to juggle different versions of the script and cuts of the film where they had different character relationships and fates. I don't want to spoil too much of this film because I've already covered the highly superior novelization. And the novelization has also helped bump the film up a little bit because it's showing me the pieces that are all there. It needed a better casting, it needed better directing, it needed a more focused production. It's a very different take on The Wolfman on Lawrence Talbot, but it works well enough, at least in print. And considering it as a Wolfman film, there's actually a lot more to talk about as well. Now, like the 2025 film, it is obvious that the father is the other Wolfman. But unlike that film, there's actually a through line about the parental abuse in the story, and the reveal informs aspects of the main characters while explaining, kind of, the central mysteries. Also in common with the 2025 film is a problem of semantics. So, okay, it's a remake of The Wolfman, where Talbot is the only one that can count as such for the title. Because of the 2 werewolves in the film, he's the only one that looks like a mixture of wolf and man. Bela's a dog. And he also kills Bela early on in the movie. When you have the other werewolf stick around a lot longer in the story and slide into the role of main antagonist, Lawrence himself is no longer the Wolfman. Now, is he? The movie's reshoots and rewrites are evident, and the decision to move away from the gorgeous practical effects they had into CGI is ill-advised for the final product. But it can get a lot worse than this. It should be a lot better. Number 5. Return of the Wolfman is not the official title of this film. It's just the translation of the original Spanish title, El Retorno del Hombre Lobo, but it works a lot better to describe this film than Night of the Werewolf or The Craving. This is Nashi's return to the werewolf versus vampire woman story as a remake with him as director, and within this story, it is also the return of the 16th century wolfman Waldemar Daninsky after he was punished for serving the evil Countess Elizabeth Bathory. When he wakes up, he demonstrates this range, switching between the charismatic and romantic Waldemar and the murderous Wolfman. But notably, he seems to want nothing to do with Bathory once he encounters women that could free him from his curse. Now, incidentally, those women are there to awake Bathory, and they regard Daninsky as crucial to those plans. But he has paid his penance for his crimes and wants to move on, something like Andreas from Return of the Vampire. Though it sounds abrupt in most plot recaps, Daninsky's decision to explicitly turn against Bathory makes sense in context, and also that marks a return of Daninsky to his franchise trope of battling vampires. This film really rushes the plot point of Karen falling for Daninsky, though. And again, other Karens will fall for Daninsky in other ways that make more sense in the plot. In a later film on this list, actually, after it happens, the film gives her a little bit more of a character, but we get a better sense of the villainous Bathory and Erica. And again, Erica is also going to be an antagonist in the later movie. I don't know. This is important because she is the chosen one, and not Bathory or Erica. So, kind of an important character role to write. It would be more interesting and would have forced more creativity if either of those 2 villains would have been the chosen one. Which, what do you know? Technically, they sort of are in a later... There's really not much of anything wrong with this film. Well, actually, Bathory calls upon her satanic lords at one point, and that includes Isten. Unless I am horribly mistaken, Isten is just Hungarian for God. Can be capital G or little g. So this is the equivalent of a particularly confused Christian calling Allah a false god during a heated debate. It's silly to call a translation of the word God I don't know. In any case, you could slot this film in with a rewatch of some of the later Hammer Dracula films, and it would pair very nicely. It's a top 5 film for a reason. All right, now number 4. Now, yes, okay, this film is much higher on this list than it has any right to be by virtue of the bad acting alone. But I really enjoy Wolfman 1979, and I think that it is at the very least a middle-of-the-road Wolfman film, and at best, well, a thought-provoking take where the seemingly simple-minded country bumpkin is not only a shrewd businessman, but capable of easily getting whatever he wants before the transformation, putting the audience in a spot to doubt him when he pulls his human allies into what otherwise might be a trap. Even if I can't convince you of that reading, I would ask you to watch the film with an open mind, and let the admittedly slow and sluggish psychological drama play out before you come to your conclusion. Most people that review this movie do so very disingenuously, assuming it is bad and taking every potshot joke they can, even when their joke proves they weren't paying attention. But it hits all the essential B-movie werewolf beats, while moving some lesser-known werewolf folklore to the forefront, such as the index finger of a werewolf being longer than the rest. Aside from the acting, which is never the foremost thing I look for in a cult film, this is a pretty decent film. I have, for number 3, I have had quite the tumultuous relationship with La Furia del Hombre Lobo. When I first watched it, I had to turn it off and could not finish it because I was not enjoying myself. I don't believe that a mark against the film, because I, as the viewer, was the one that failed to finish it, thus giving up the chance for an informed opinion. And sure enough, when I sat down to watch it again with fresher eyes, I found this film fascinating. This is Nashi's 4th, though really 3rd, and possibly later draft of the 2nd, Daninsky film, and it reimagines the werewolf as a modern-day professor whose wife cheats on him, setting into motion a plot that involves Daninsky's 2 other scientist love interests, bringing him back to life. Again, the names of these characters are Waldemar Daninsky, Erica, Karen, Barbara, Ilona, though her real name is Ava Wolfstein, etc. And the archetypes are similar to Nashi's other works with these characters. But what clicked into place for me with this viewing is how this film effectively modernizes the Daninsky myth. The modern equivalent to Count Daninsky is Professor Daninsky, as the modern equivalent of the satanic vampires that have brought him back to life, and brought Imre back to life in the first film, would be a mad scientist such as Ilona. Now yes, in some ways, this is retreading Assignment Terror, wherein aliens revive the monsters to set upon the world, but again, all that we know of Nashi's lost second Daninsky film is that it had essentially the same plot as this 4th one, so my point still stands. Through the lens of how this film modernizes the iconography and motifs of the classic werewolf story, we must ask ourselves, what is this story saying about being the Wolfman? What makes the Wolfman is a question every film on this list will answer differently. But this is one of Nashi's less bestial designs. Just some hair over the face and hands, and he can walk normally. He is even capable of a sex scene while in the getup. Kind of weird. What motivates this Wolfman is self-destructive rage at finding out his wife cheated on him. And this film is called The Fury of the Wolfman, so that anger as the focus is what makes the Wolfman, what he represents here. So Ilona, who has a variety of mutant experiments alongside her Daninsky project, says she's trying to cure men's self-destructive instincts. So especially in light of all the heinous stuff this version does, I think the film is actually saying that the Wolfman represents the dark impulses of a broken man. Now granted, some third act reveals about Ilona complicate this reading somewhat, but her role is still a more interesting take than what Return of the Wolfman did for its female leads later on, but earlier in the list. And Ilona's connection to Daninsky is the one the film focuses on in its final resolution, not Karen and not Erica, which is interesting. Number 2, a lot of commentators look down on Nashi's earlier work compared to his later films, and I really don't understand why. Of all his films that I've seen, his introduction to the Daninsky idea, La Marca del Hombre Lobo, really has the best characterization for the cast. Now yes, there are sizable gaps in my Nashi knowledge, and also some films, had they capitalized on the opportunities present, would have been a lot higher. See Dr. Jekyll and the Wolfman. To this day, I am also still somewhat obsessed with the concept of a big-budget remake of Assignment Terror, because that film has the best premise I think I've ever heard in my life. The Wolfman is brought to life as part of a planned 9 from outer space, but fights to take down the aliens and return to rest. But I'm getting off topic. We have a video on Assignment Terror that you can follow the links to find. The Mark of the Wolfman is just also effective for how it immediately shows off how different Daninsky will be from Talbot. This werewolf is a count that is knowledgeable in the occult, and his films will not have the same restrictions for blood, gore, and passion the Universal placed on the Chaney films. Having to deal with the werewolf Imre Wolfstein twice and 2 vampires all in the same movie shows how devoted Nashi was to the monster mash format that he would experiment with so effectively throughout the series. And the film still stands on its own merits. I prefer to rewatch many of the films below this, but I genuinely think this would be the second best Wolfman film that we can talk about today. So, of course, number 1, unsurprisingly, the original Wolfman film from Kurt Siodmak is the best. There is so much to read into the movie, down to, okay, what is this Wolfman about? He is the Wolfman because he's somewhat predatory going after Gwen, and then the curse brings those instincts to the forefront. He cannot hide them any longer. He's also an outsider in the thing, so he moves closer to the Roma characters in the story, who are also outsiders in the same land. It's a story about his conflict with his father, but it's not a ham-fisted, oh, his father's also an evil, mustache-twirling werewolf. It's just miscommunication, which brings that final image of Sir John beating his son to death, not knowing it's his son he's killing with the cane. Such a beautiful film. Probably the best, or at least top 3 of Universal's whole classic monsters catalog. And there's also the other elements of the story, the World War II allegory that it somewhat plays out. There's so much to say about the movie, and so much we probably will say later on about the movie. Unsurprisingly, it is the top spot, but I really wanted to highlight the ones beneath it for this video, because they all take the Wolfman idea set up by this movie more so than anything else, and go off in wildly different directions with it. Is the Wolfman sympathetic? Is the Wolfman evil? How evil is the Wolfman compared to other monsters, to other creatures in the story? House of the Wolfman, he's kind of the main villain, even in a story that has Dracula and Frankenstein's monster. Other stories have multiple werewolves, and I gotta confess that werewolf on werewolf as the final battle is the least interesting permutation to me. I think it's so much more interesting to have the werewolf fight literally anything else. The tension just gets ramped up if it's werewolves versus humans, werewolves versus vampires, werewolves versus mummies, werewolf versus a tiger also happens at one point in Nashi's films. But it's still also nice to see the variety of these Wolfman fight scenes that go throughout the thing. And we see other actors try to tackle this tortured protagonist tragedy of yielding to the animal impulses and trying to fight them but being unable to. Some actors do better than others, and even the ones that do it pretty poorly are still fun to watch. I'd recommend all these films to a degree. And many of these films, at least 7 of them, I'd recommend pretty highly. So, here on Plan 9 Crunch, we have other videos about wolfmen and werewolf-type characters, or universal monsters, if your preference goes that way. We also have a TikTok page, and we have a Facebook page, Plan 9 Crunch Podcast and blog, a conventional blog as well, where we've written some stuff about, and also not about, the universal monsters. So much stuff you can look into at your own discretion. Thank you all for watching, and that's a wrap.